Hey, what's up? Today I wanted to just share 7 reasons why I think most liquidity providers lose money when they're trying to yield farm or trying to generate yield from their assets. And I'll also talk about how you could fix these mistakes that could be costing you a lot of money down the line as well. So let's get into it. The reason why I want to make this video is because I've seen a ton of liquidity providers lose money. I've talked to dozens of investors and yield farmers, and a lot of these mistakes could be obvious for people that have been yield farming for a while. But if you're starting out, maybe some of these are not so obvious. And some of these mistakes are pretty minor, but you could lose a lot of money by the death of 1,000 cuts, right? Because if you're losing like a couple percentage here, a couple percentage there, it adds up and it could accelerate your losses before you realize. And mistakes are often costly and can take time to play out. So I've seen a ton of people that got really excited because they just got started from yield farming, but then they find out like, okay, 6 months, 12 months down the line, they suffered a ton of losses because the strategies that they have been learning or using are simply not sustainable and are not actually well designed because there's just too much misinformation out there. There's a ton of people that would be baiting you with really high APR, but in reality, a lot of those strategies are actually not profitable or not sustainable long term. So, the first mistake that is probably already pretty obvious for most liquid providers is that if you're not prioritizing asset selection, the chances of you losing money is actually really high. Most people actually just look at the APR or follow the hype of the asset. Some of the freshly launched tokens might have a lot of volume running through, but if the asset is not really good, you could actually lose a ton of money if the prices do drop below your entry. And a lot of times that is the case for these assets that have a lot of APR, but might not have really sound fundamentals, or the market is just weak where a lot of these speculative assets are just going to drop in price. Most people don't understand the risks that underlie these assets. And I personally have been guilty of this as well in the last year or two when I'm selecting these assets. Some of these assets are simply too high risk. And when the market is really good, it does make sense to be like taking more risk because these higher risk assets often have higher APR and they also go up more in percentage amount, right? But the problem is if these assets do dump aggressively, chances are you're going to lose money, right? But if we are sticking with major assets like Ethereum or Bitcoin, this is not as big of an issue as long as you're holding it long term and prices are either like near your entry or above your entry. Chances are you're not going to lose money in that case, right? But basically, we need to be selecting assets that are likely to move up over time or at least sustain in value. It doesn't really make sense to be yield farming assets that could be giving you like 100% APR, but then after a year, the asset drops by like 70, 80%. At the end of the day, you are going to lose money if you are yield farming assets that bleed out. And sticking with majors or assets with good fundamentals is actually a great idea. And the market has basically shifted to being more fundamentals driven. And a lot of these speculative assets, there's just too many of them. And it's just very hard to pick like which one is going to take off, which one is not. So, from my experience, sticking with majors is probably a great idea, especially if you are deploying more capital and you might not want to risk too much of your capital. And my personal portfolio is pretty high risk because I do have other investments to offset the losses. I am still pretty young, so I don't mind taking on more risk. The riskier the asset, the more chance you're going to be losing money when you are yield farming, right? So we got to make sure that we are taking the risk that we're comfortable with. And the second reason why most liquidity providers lose money is they're setting the ranges way too tight. And if you've been watching this channel for a while, I've talked about this a ton of time already. If you are setting a tight range, it means you're taking a very high risk because you're going to be missing out on more pumps, and then you're going to have more capital depreciation on the dumps as well. So let me show you an example scenario here. Let's just say you entered ETH to USD CLP at around $3,000, right? What a lot of people do is they squeeze the range and maybe have a $1,000 wide range, let's say 2,500 to 3,000. But you can see just by drawing on the chart and just look at the historical price action, prices don't tend to stay in this zone for a very long time, right? A lot of times prices do swing up like $1,000, $2,000 to the upside or the downside in the span of just a couple of months. So in this scenario, we're actually taking a lot of risk. And let me use the Drippy calculator. You'd have to join the Drippy membership to get access to Drippy tools, but if budget is an issue, you could always use the Desmos calculator that I've shared multiple times on my channel. But just because this video is more teaching you the concepts, I want to use this easier calculator, right? So let's just say I want to deposit 100K into an E to USDC LP. My entry price is at $3,000 in the scenario that I just talked about. And then min price is at 2,500. Max price is at 3,500, and I could reset this simulation price here. If I kind of zoom out, you're going to be able to see this liquidity curve here. And like I said, if you are yield farming a tight range, your upside is going to be more limited, but then also your downside is going to be a lot if prices do drop. So this is a trade-off that you are making when you are yield farming a tight range. You're often not going to have the best capital gains, and then you're going to be exposed to a lot of capital losses if the prices do move down, but you're going to be gaining some cash flow in the process, right? You can see if prices do move up all the way to $4,000, you're only going to be gaining about like 3% gain on your capital, which is very little. But if the APR you earn during the whole period is more than like the capital appreciation, then you would have been better off yield farming this pair. But at the same time, we just went over that the prices don't tend to stay in this tight range for very long at all, right? And let's just say prices do drop to $2,000, which is where we are right now. You're going to be suffering about almost 30% loss here on the downside. So on the upside, you gain like 3%. On the downside, you are suffering a 29% loss. And of course, some people would just say that you could just withdraw your liquidity, just hold your asset. It's the same as holding some ETH. Of course, that is something that you could do, but you got to keep in mind that if you're out of range, you're not going to be earning the APR, right? But the main issue here, in my opinion, is that you're going to be forced to rebalance, which can lock in a ton of losses. And this could be easily shown with the beefy pools that I often talk about on my channel. If you go to ETH to USDC pair and you could choose anything here and kind of look into it, sometimes it is profitable if the fees are high enough, but oftentimes they're not. For example, this ETH to USDC LP, we could easily see that the strategy is using a tight range and it's kind of tracking where the price action goes, right? If prices go up, it rebalances to chase the range. If prices go down, you're rebalancing to chase the range again. And the reason why they do this is to try to get a high APY. A lot of people advertise on YouTube or on X or whatever. They're saying you could earn 50, 100% APR on blue chip assets like ETH to USDC. But the actual result often looks like this. You can see the average APR is pretty high, about 100% here for this particular beefy pool. But if we go to this price tab, which includes all the compounding already, we could actually see the real profit and loss for this type of strategy. You can see for this particular beefy pool, it started at about 711 billion. And right now the pool is at about like 500 billion, right? So pretty significant loss, more than 20% loss. And if we just go to the position tab, you can see 1 year ago, ETH was trading at around 2,200. Right now, ETH is trading at 2,000. So it's only a 10% drop on ETH price, but you are getting more than 20% drop on your LP, which already includes all the fee compounding and stuff like that. So in my opinion, it's very difficult to manage. Some people would try to hedge the tight range LP with shorts and stuff like that. And if you're just starting out, it's just not going to be very profitable, if profitable at all, right? And the fix is pretty simple. You just set wider ranges, and I'll show you how I set my ranges. A lot of times what I like to do is start from the weekly chart, and we can use different indicators, like for example, the Bollinger Bands, to kind of see like how volatile the asset is. And I can use the Bollinger Band to kind of guide my decision as well. This is just one of the ways that I personally use to set ranges. If I want to prioritize fees, maybe I would set the upper range at 4,000 and maybe the lower range is at 1,500 or slightly lower here, maybe like 1,300. You can see prices do tend to stay in this zone for ETH in particular. And if I want to be a little bit more conservative, I could always bump the upper range to 5,000, but I could also keep it at around like 4,300 here to kind of be a little bit wider than the Bollinger Bands. And you can see with this wide of a range, it's very easy for me to stay in range and I'm going to have more capital gains and I don't really have to rebalance if I don't want to, right? Which kind of leads me to the next point. The third way that most people lose money is through rebalancing. Most people actually don't know how to rebalance. They don't simulate their rebalancing and you could lock in a ton of losses if you just rebalance, especially if you are using a tight range strategy. We just went over the range chasing strategy that a lot of automated vaults do, like Beefy. It does not work and it just incurs a ton of losses unless the APR is just so high compared to the volatility. But a lot of times, if the APR is that high already, you're still going to be profitable with a wide range with much less like management, much less risk. So why use a tight range or a range chasing strategy in the first place, right? And range chasing is probably the worst type of rebalancing. You should not be actually doing it at all, in my opinion, because you could be locking in a ton of losses. And I can show you with this Drippy simulator as well. One of the functions that we have built is to actually simulate the rebalancing. And I'm not showing you this so that you have to subscribe to this or whatever. I think it's a very helpful tool. And by subscribing, we are reinvesting a lot of the profits to like develop these tools so that more liquid providers could have access to them and could actually make more profit in the market, right? But I just want to show you what a lot of liquid providers do. For example, we have a $1,000 wide range, like what we set up, and then we entered at 3K. What if prices go to 2,500? A lot of people would rebalance down, and I can click this rebalance button here and some people would just track the range. Let's just say the new price is at 2,500 and I want to have a $1,000 wide range. So then the new range would be 2,000 to 3,000, right? And you can see how the equity curve changes here. If prices keep dumping, I would lose value less than what I had before. So that's a great thing. But if prices bounce back to $3,000, you can see I'm not going to recover all of my capital. The blue dashed line is the old LP that we had. So you can see that we are going to be locking in about like almost 9% of losses, which is pretty significant. If the LP is earning, let's just say 50% APR, 9% of losses is almost like 2 months worth of fees, right? And sometimes you're not going to be in range for even 2 months. So this is pretty significant. And if prices keep dropping to, let's say, $2,000 and you do another rebalance there from, let's say, the new price is 1,500 to 2,500, that's the new range. You're locking in even further losses here at a 21% loss. So 21K here, almost 22%. And let's just say the price bounced back to 2,500. I do another rebalance and then I do the same thing again. $1,000 wide range, 2,000 to 3,000. You can see that the lock in permanent loss did kind of drop a little bit, but I still kind of locked in like 18K worth of losses, right? And a lot of times it's just not profitable. That's why the beefy pool is not profitable. And some people would try to do like the rebalance before getting out of range to minimize the impermanent loss. Yes, the impermanent loss would lessen a little bit, but it's still very, very tricky to manage. And a lot of times you're still at a risk of not actually being profitable after you lock in a ton of losses. Versus if you have a wider range, you don't really have to rebalance that much at all. And you could always do like the other rebalancing strategies that I've shared on my channel. That is allowing us to rebalance with no impermanent loss at all, right? So that is a strategy that a lot of beginner liquid providers use. And if you're a little bit more advanced, maybe you've heard of the snuggle rebalance that a lot of people teaches, but you are often locking in losses as well with that type of rebalance. Let's just say you have a range of, again, 2,500 to 3,500. So starting over, price is at 3K. And let's just say the price drops to like $2,300, just right out of range, right? Only $200 less. And let's just say I want to do a snuggle rebalance. The way that a lot of people teaches is you're kind of moving down the bottom range to match this current price. That's like snuggling down, but then you don't want to adjust the upper range. And this is where like a lot of people mistakenly believe that you're not locking in impermanent loss. But let me show you the effects here. So I click rebalance. If I don't adjust my range, you can see that prices recovering to 3K. It's actually not locking in any losses at all because you're holding the same exact position. You're going to recover your money. But let's just say you want to snuggle down because you want the prices to bounce back so you could start earning fees again. what you're going to notice is that if you don't move the upper range, you're still locking in a pretty significant amount of losses here at around like almost 4%. And if prices do drift lower, let's say to 2100, so $200 lower again, what I can do is simulate another snuggle here. So I snuggle down once more, and then I'm locking in even more losses here at 7K. And then let's just say prices do drop to like 1900. I snuggle once more to 1900 to 3500. So this is where like people mistakenly again believe that you're not locking in losses, but by the time the prices hit 1900 and you snuggle to 1900, you've already locked in about like 11 to 12K worth of losses if prices do go back to 3K. So this is why this video is so important. And if you're still watching and you're getting a ton of value out of this, please like, subscribe, and maybe share this video with some of your friends. It's going to help me grow the channel by a lot. I try to give you the best information possible so that you don't make these mistakes that could be costing you like thousands of dollars without knowing it, right? And let's just say the prices do go all the way back to 3K. Again, we're going to have this value here, 88.5K. And let's just say the price actually went up instead of down this time. So price goes to 3,700, slightly out of range here. And I want to do one more snuggle here to kind of drive the point home, right? Prices go to 3,700, you can see it is still going to lock in 1% more of losses here. And let's just say the prices do go all the way to 4,500 and you do another snuggle up. This one is a little bit wider snuggle. And here the end result is you locked in about like 18% of losses. And I think this scenario is pretty realistic for stuff like ETH to USDC. You can see that during the middle of 2024, prices are kind of near like 2,500. It jumps to 4,000 and then drops all the way below like 1,500 and then pumps all the way back to almost 5K and then now retrace back to 2K. So if you're like snuggling up and down, you could actually be locking in almost like 20% worth of losses. And of course, you're going to be earning fees in the meantime. So that's a great thing, but you're still locking in a pretty significant amount of losses versus if you just start with a wider range in the first place, you're locking in basically zero losses, right? And the thing is, if you're rebalancing this way, you're kind of like expanding your range and your APR is gonna be like lower and lower anyway. So you are actually locking in a ton of losses. So don't do that. I don't think it's a great idea to be snuggling too much. What I like to do instead is we want to again set wider ranges so we don't have to rebalance in the first place. That's the ideal scenario. But we could also do the expand and squeeze rebalance. I've gone through that on my channel. Just look for expand and squeeze. And let's just say we start from 3K again. So not the best entry price because ETH is now trading at 2K. But let's just say instead of being too greedy, we want to set a range of 1,500 to 4,500. So a very conservative range. Of course, our APR is going to be lower, but we are going to be taking much less risk in this scenario. Let's just say price drops all the way to $2,000. So a pretty aggressive dump. What we're going to have is about like 28% worth of USDC left, right? If we kind of reset, we start with more USDC compared to ETH, but prices drop and we are a little bit concerned about prices maybe potentially moving below 2,500. What I could do is instead of just holding tight, I could do the expand and squeeze strategy, right? So the price is at 2K. What I want to do is expand the range and I could use this zero swap button. And if you don't have access to a Drippy tool, you just need to learn how to use like this Desmos calculator. But basically the concept still holds. What we want to do in this case is expand our range and make zero swaps. So you can see this min floor price here. We just want to make sure that the new minimum range that we set is higher than this amount. So let's just say I want to expand my range all the way to $1,000. It's going to calculate you a new max range so that you make zero swap on our capital, right? If I go back to my initial position, you can see that I would be left with 22.96K USDC. After I expanded my range, I still have the same amount of ETH and USDC if the price is at 2K or I hit rebalance. And you can see that the equity curve is actually quite different from the strategy that we were using previously. And you can see that if prices actually recover to 3K, we actually gain about 4 to 5% worth of our capital here. and prices could go up and down. And as long as it recovers to 3K, we're actually locking in some profit in this scenario instead of locking in losses. The downside with this strategy is that when you're in this expand mode, basically a recovery mode, you're not going to be earning as much APR as the tighter range that you initially set, right? That 1500 to 4500 range. So that is something to keep in mind. But at the same time, it's going to allow you to stay in range for longer, just in case prices do drift below 2K and go all the way to maybe 1500 to 1300. It would kind of drop like below your initial range that you had. So you are gaining some benefit here, and you are going to be making more money if prices do bounce back. So that is a expand and squeeze strategy that I really like. And you could always squeeze back the range if you want to. Let's just say prices bounce to about like 2300, and you think that the price is going to be okay, you're not going to get out of range to the downside. You could always do another rebalance here and set the range back to what we had in position one, right? And after we do that, of course, we are going to be giving up some of the upside. But you can see if prices do bounce back to 3K, I'm going to have this amount here, which is like 100.56K. And I've basically locked in like zero impermanent losses in this scenario. So this is actually a really great strategy if you don't want to lock in any impermanent losses, and you're going to be earning these yield in the process. And as long as ETH is trading above wherever you entered at, you're going to be in a nice profit. So this strategy is actually not path dependent, and it's not actually going to be suffering if you are rebalancing more often than like the tighter range strategies. And we could always use the liquidity rotation strategy as well. Let's say you're out of range to the downside for ETH to USDC. You could always take your ETH and you could yield farm different pairs like ETH to wrap Bitcoin or ETH to Sol. That is also another valid strategy. You just want to make sure that you're comfortable with those two underlying assets. In my opinion, that strategy is probably still better than a lot of these other strategies like the range chasing strategy. Or if you're snuggling without moving the upper range, then that is still locking in a pretty significant amount of losses. If you do want to use the snuggle rebound strategy, I highly recommend adjusting the upper range as well. I've covered that using the Desmos calculator on my channel, so just look for that. But the main thing that is actually causing you a lot of trouble is chasing the APR. The reason why people actually set a tight range in the first place is because they want a higher APR, right? Most people just look at the APR and deploy, they set the ranges, they never run any simulations, they have no idea what the capital is going to do if prices go up, and they have no idea how the profit and loss would be if prices go down. So you need to know like how the liquidity pool is getting impacted, and it's actually pretty different from like holding spot, because a lot of times if we are yield farming like ETH to USDC, for example, and ETH goes up in price, you're going to be selling your assets and your capital gains is not going to be as much. There's different strategies to kind of try to get more capital gains. For example, one of my favorite ones is setting a really wide upper range. That's how you actually get a capital appreciation that is closer to holding spot while earning APR in the process. But most people just don't simulate. That's why they don't know all of this. And that's why I know all of these stuff that I teach you guys on my channel, right? Because I actually spend like 80% of my time simulating different scenarios, running through everything and making sure the numbers make sense, the risk and reward makes sense. And then the rest is like maybe scanning for pools, like tracking my positions and stuff like that, right? So simulation is actually the overlooked part and the most underutilized, in my opinion, when it comes to yield farming. The APR simply doesn't matter if you lose too much capital in the process, right? And I've seen a lot of channels that talk about like, okay, you're going to be earning thousands of dollars. You're going to be earning like 100% APR on blue chip assets. But a lot of times you're going to be net unprofitable if you use those unsustainable strategies. So the solution is pretty simple for this problem. Just prioritize selecting assets, set a sustainable range, and realize that profit and loss and fund safety matters much more in the end compared to how much APR that you generate. It doesn't matter that you're generating 100% APR if at the end of the day, you're not actually making any profit or you're actually in a loss in the process. And you might be wondering if that's possible to be earning so much fees and then also incurring a loss at the same time. Just go back to the beefy pool example that I showed you, right? This is an example of a strategy that does not work. and you're just going to end up with less money in the process. And a lot of people teach strategies that don't work, unfortunately. So we need to be careful and run our own numbers. And then also, the number five reason why most people lose money when providing liquidity is through using leverage, and they don't really know how to use leverage or when to do so and how to manage a leverage position. Most people are over leveraged, meaning that if they are, for example, depositing their assets, if you're borrowing like 40 to 50% against your assets, a lot of times if prices move down, you're going to be stuck in those leverage positions that can't really unwind really easily. And it depends on what you're using with the leverage capital as well. If you are borrowing stables and then you're farming stables, that is lower risk than if you are borrowing stables and then you're farming concentrated liquidity, right? And I do have a client position that is open right now that is using like ETH and wrap Bitcoin as collateral. We are borrowing USDC and we're yield farming ETH to USDC, but we're only using like very, very low leverage. I think it was like 15, 16% LTV compared to maybe the 40, 50% that a lot of people uses, or 30, 40%, that is going to be higher and higher risk. And in those scenarios, we're actually in a leveraged long position where we could be benefiting more if prices rebound. But a lot of times you don't want to be using those positions when prices are high, right? I've seen a lot of people get stuck in their positions because they are executing a leveraged long at a high price, and then maybe they're over leveraged and that is like their only strategy, and you're just stuck in that position and you're forced to make tough decisions. Okay, should I like lock in my losses, deleverage and stuff like that, right? And we got to realize that leverage often cuts both ways. Of course, you're not going to suffer impermanent loss on the lent capital. If I'm lending ETH and wrap Bitcoin, I'm yield farming with the USDC I borrowed, prices move up, I'm not selling any of my ETH that I lent out, right? But if you are leveraged long, which we are in that scenario, your capital is going to depreciate more rapidly if prices do dump pretty aggressively. So the more leverage you take out, the more capital depreciation you're going to have if prices move against you. And in this scenario, if prices move down, prices are moving against me, right? And the main way against that is to use leverage sparingly and strategically. Like the client position that I help manage, you can see I am lending out some ETH and Bitcoin here, and then borrowing some USDC. I think I said I wrapped Bitcoin beforehand, but it's Coinbase Bitcoin. Anyways, we borrowed USDC and we are yield farming ETH to USDC. You can see that it is generating a decent amount of fees that I could use to deleverage this position. But this portfolio also have some Solana position. It's worth almost like 120K. So taking a 10K loan out is less than like a 10% overall leverage on our entire portfolio, right? And it's pretty easy to deleverage if we really need to. There's different positions, like for example, Hype and UETH, that I could remove the capital from and then add as collateral. And there's this ETH to USDC position that we could remove and repay the loan if we really need to. And the reason why we went with this position is because the prices are low enough, and we also have some positions that are out of range to the downside. So we use that as the collateral instead, right? And you basically want to think about like, okay, these positions are long positions and you want to use it when it makes sense to do so. It does not make sense to be like taking out leverage and be leveraged long when prices are high. Unfortunately, it's very tempting to do so. A lot of people took out the loans when Bitcoin is like above 100K, and now they're suffering when Bitcoin retraced all the way to 66K, right? And you could use leverage to short and balance the long delta you have on your portfolio as well. Let's say you're holding like 2 Bitcoin or you're holding like 100 ETH, and you could use, for example, stable coins to deposit onto Aave and then borrow some ETH to kind of leverage short in those scenarios as well. But you want to make sure that you're doing it when it makes sense to do so. And we got to have a plan in case the prices do move against us. Like in the client portfolio, we are going to be withdrawing our liquidity and maybe potentially adding it as collateral or repaying some of the loans. If prices do drop too aggressively, maybe ETH is at like $1,000 or something, right? That is something that we have to be prepared to do. The chances of us losing money in that scenario is going to be much less than if you don't have a plan in place. And you really got to know your numbers when you are running leverage strategy. I teach all of these concepts in the DeFi Blueprint course as well. If you're part of Drippy, you could go through all of those training materials. There's like 20 something hours worth of training. that is teaching you how to like structure your portfolio, how to use leverage and stuff like that, how to deleverage in case things do go wrong, and how to manage leverage position. For example, I like to repay these loans more aggressively to de-risk versus just keeping leverage on perpetually, right? So those are all the things that we could do. And the number six reason why most people lose money is through hacks and scams. So this is actually my biggest loss in the yield farming and investing journey. I lost like 76K from a social engineering scam in 2025. I think it was September. I've made a video on that. Basically, the guy was posing as a client and he was asking me to do some stuff that is maybe I kind of glossed over. At first, some of the requests was reasonable. He was asking me, okay, how do I set up wallets and stuff like that? But he basically mixed in like a bunch of requests that some of them are reasonable, and he was manipulating me emotionally, and he was getting me to like multitask and stuff like that. I didn't really slow down to double check everything, and I ended up making a mistake that costed me 76K, right? And if you're sending too much funds to a hot wallet, even just for like a split second, that is a bad thing to do. That's how I lost my money. I thought the hot wallet is secure because I set it up, but apparently the scammer had access to either my computer or I made a mistake along the way. So that hot wallet was compromised. So you never really know if your hot wallet is compromised or not until you actually lose the funds. That's why we should not be sending too much to a hot wallet, even for a split second. And another key mistake is just not using a dedicated crypto device that you are using for these blue chip protocols that you're not downloading stuff on. And here's the solution. Basically, we want to learn more about hacks and scams. We want to be aware of the different methods that people are trying to use to manipulate us. Unfortunately, there's just a lot of that in crypto. We want to make sure that we're doing stuff like setting a secure password and using a 3 wallet system. So without actually turning this video into like a wallet security video, this is something that we should actually set up. Basically, you don't want to be sending too much funds to a hot wallet, even for a second, or your NFT positions that you get when you enter into a yield farming position. You don't want to be like sending it in and out to a hot wallet because, again, just assume that this hot wallet is compromised, right? I only use a hot wallet now pretty much to just demo on YouTube and to like test new dApps, because sometimes these new dApps do require a wallet connection before you are able to see like the different stats and stuff like that. So that is what the hot wallet I usually use for. And basically, you can connect your cold wallet or your hardware wallet to a browser wallet like Rabby without actually inputting the seed phrase, right? You want to make sure that you're connecting the wallet without inputting the seed phrase. That is actually really, really important. After you connect it, you could interact it. After you connect it with Rabby, you could interact with different dApps. And I like to kind of separate my wallets a little bit. I have my cold wallet that I use with major dApps like Uniswap or Aave. And then I have another separate cold wallet that I use with smaller dApps like Project X on Hyper EVM. That is a DEX that is smaller. So that is something that I like to do. And instead of keeping all of your funds in one wallet, because even if you have a hardware wallet, if you mistakenly sign a malicious transaction, you could lose all of your funds as well. For example, in the last couple of months, Aerodrome got their domain compromised. So if you were signing transactions on the official Aerodrome website, because the domain is compromised, you could actually be getting to the wrong website and signing malicious transaction that could drain your wallet, right? So it's helpful to be spreading out to different wallets, or at least at the very, very minimum, create sub accounts on your hardware wallet. And I think it's also really helpful to have a HODL cold wallet where you're not interacting with DeFi, so that you could hold funds securely and you don't have to worry about like signing smart contracts that could compromise your funds, right? So in my opinion, you need at least 2 to 3 wallets to be really secure. You should be using like hardware wallets most of the time. And I only use like a pure hot wallet for testing new dApps. So that is wallet security. And knowing about that basically would cover you like 90% of the way. And I highly recommend like learning more about wallet security on your own free time. And the seventh way that most people lose money is through taxes. And this is probably the most overlooked one. It's the hidden cost of LPing. If you're living in the US, you have to worry about the capital gains tax as well as the income tax. I think Awaken is one of the best ones for liquidity providers. But basically, you're going to be spending extra time on taxes if you are providing liquidity. And this is especially bad for tight ranges because if you are using tight ranges and you have 50 positions, 100 positions at a time, or like throughout the year, you're going to be running through these transactions and you're going to have to like figure out all the taxes for that, right? You are suffering capital gains tax if you are, for example, entering into a position and then you're removing your liquidity when you have cap gains on those positions. And one of the biggest downside with tight range LPing is that sometimes you will be suffering capital losses and you are making more income. You are going to be owing those income taxes even though you suffered a lot of capital gains. In the US, I believe you could deduct some capital losses against your income, but you can't do too much of it. So that is something to consider. And I'm not giving you financial advice or tax advice in these videos. So make sure you're talking to your CPA. But basically, to handle this problem, you do need to talk to a professional. It might be possible to write off with an LLC, or you have a trust or a Roth IRA or something that is owning your LLC. I'm no longer a US citizen, so I don't have to worry about that. But if you are, you have to look into that, and you want to avoid using too much tight ranges and short-term strategies because you're going to be dealing with a lot of tax problems and you could be owing a lot of taxes even though your positions are not profitable. That might not be the case with like wider range LPs. You're not going to be earning as much fees, but it's often more tax efficient than those tighter range LPs. And you can have longer term investments that you don't have to realize capital gains taxes on. If you are holding a LP position for the long term, I believe more than a year, I think in the US it counts as long term capital gains tax. So you don't have to pay as much taxes for those longer term LPs as well. And I've seen positions that have been in range for like 3 to 4 years. So you don't necessarily have to remove your position to lock in any capital gains if you don't want to, or you could use different strategies. For example, prices are high. You're using a perp short to kind of capture profit instead of locking in capital gains tax. That is also another strategy that you could use as well. And if you're a non US citizen, you could consider using the trifecta method where you are living in three different countries, you're rotating, you're technically not a tax resident in those countries, and then you're basically owing zero taxes, right? But that comes with a downside that you have to travel more often. And if you like to stay in one place, it's always a great thing if you find a place with better tax rates. So that's pretty much it for this video, guys. Again, the 7 mistakes are just not prioritizing asset selection. You're setting the ranges too tight. If you're rebalancing too often or you don't know how to rebalance, that could become a huge issue. If you're chasing the APR, if you're using leverage too much and you don't know how to manage those positions, if you're not protecting yourself against hacks and scams, and lastly, if you don't plan out your taxes, that could become an issue as well. So a little bit of a longer video. Hopefully it was helpful, and be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already. It's going to help me reach more people, and hopefully I could help more people in the process so that we could all make more money and lose less money together. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you on the next one.